One wrong turn led me straight to his bed. Welcome to the world of Western romance. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The violent crack of the rifle shot was the sound that tore Georgia's world apart, a deafening punctuation mark at the end of a life she had once understood. One moment, the stagecoach was a rumbling, rhythmic cocoon, its worn leather seats and the dusty scent of the trail a familiar comfort after weeks of travel. The next, it was a tableau of chaos, splintering wood, and the panicked screams of horses. The driver's curse was choked off, followed by a sickening thud that needed no explanation. Rough, unshaven faces appeared in the windows, their eyes glittering with a predatory greed that turned her blood to ice. They were not just thieves, they were wolves, and she was the lamb they had cornered. A hand clawed at the lace of her bodice, and in that instant, a survival instinct she never knew she possessed erupted. She didn't think. She reacted, shoving with all her might and scrambling out the opposite door, tumbling onto the hard-packed earth in a flurry of light blue fabric and tangled golden curls. She didn't look back, not at the bandits pulling her meager trunk from the roof, nor at the other terrified passengers. Her only thought was the dense, forbidding line of trees on the horizon, a promise of shadow and escape. She ran until her lungs burned with the fire of 1,000 suns, and her city-soft shoes were torn to shreds by the unforgiving terrain. The unfamiliar wilderness closed in around her, a vast and indifferent expanse of rock, sagebrush, and looming pines that seemed to watch her with silent judgment. The setting sun painted the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, casting long, menacing shadows that clawed at her heels and turned every twisted branch into a lurking figure. A deep, resonant rumble echoed from the west, not the sound of another gunshot, but the growl of an approaching storm, its belly dark and heavy with unshed rain. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. She was utterly, hopelessly lost, a fragile speck of civilization about to be swallowed whole by the wild. Her light blue dress, so carefully chosen for travel, was now ripped and stained with dirt, the cream-colored corset that cinched her hourglass waist feeling less like a fashionable accessory and more like a cage constricting her every desperate breath. Just as the last vestiges of hope began to fray, she saw it, a tiny, flickering point of light, warm and yellow against the encroaching twilight. It was a beacon in the oppressive darkness, a fragile promise of shelter. With renewed purpose, Georgia stumbled toward the light, her movements clumsy and graceless. The journey took an eternity, her body screaming in protest with every step, until she finally broke through a line of trees and found herself standing before a small, sturdy ranch house. It was a fortress of solitude, built of thick, dark logs and nestled into a protective fold of the hills, its single illuminated window staring out into the wilderness like a vigilant eye. A deep porch wrapped around the front, and a sense of order, of deliberate defensibility, radiated from the place. This was not the home of a welcoming family. It was the lair of a man who expected trouble. Too desperate to care, she hauled her aching body up the few steps and collapsed against the heavy wooden door, her knuckles barely managing a feeble rap before her strength gave out. The door didn't creak open. It swung inward with a smooth, silent weight that spoke of well-oiled hinges and constant readiness. The man who filled the frame was as solid and imposing as the house itself. He was tall, with a breadth of shoulder that blocked the warm light from the cabin, casting him an intimidating silhouette. A light brown cowboy hat, stained with sweat and dust, was pulled low, shadowing a face dominated by a scruffy, dusty blonde beard that traveled from his sharp jawline down under his chin. He wore no shirt, only trousers held up by suspenders, and his chest and arms were a testament to hard labor, corded with muscle and dusted with fine hair. But it was his eyes, when they finally caught the faint light, that held her captive. They were the color of a stormy sea, a deep and turbulent gray that assessed her in a single, sweeping glance, taking in her disheveled golden hair, her torn dress that did little to hide her generous cleavage, and her obvious state of distress. His hand, she noted with a fresh jolt of fear, rested casually on the handle of a Colt revolver holstered at his hip. "What do you want?" His voice was a low growl, rough like stones grinding together, devoid of warmth or welcome. It was the voice of a man who had long ago forgotten the pleasantries of conversation. Georgia struggled to find her own voice, pushing herself upright. "Please," she croaked, the word raw and desperate. My stagecoach. It was attacked. Bandits. I ran. I'm lost. He didn't move, his expression unreadable, his gaze unwavering. He was a wall of silent observation, his suspicion a palpable force in the air between them. He looked past her, into the darkening woods from which she had emerged, his eyes scanning the perimeter with a practiced intensity that chilled her to the bone. He was listening not to her words, but to the sounds of the night, searching for the threat he seemed to always expect. The wind picked up, whipping a stray curl across her face and carrying the first cold drops of rain. She shivered, a tremor that racked her entire body, born of both cold and terror. That small, involuntary movement seemed to be what finally broke the stalemate. His gaze dropped back to her, a flicker of something, not pity perhaps, but a grudging sense of honor, passing through their stormy depths. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod and stepped back from the doorway, a silent, begrudging invitation. "Get inside," he commanded, the words clipped and sharp. "The storm won't wait on you." She scrambled past him into the cabin, the warmth of the fire and the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee enveloping her like a blanket. The interior was Spartan, functional, and immaculately clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a rifle mounted above it. A simple table with 2 chairs, a bed neatly made in the corner, and shelves lined with tins and supplies. There were no decorations, no personal touches, save for a small, locked chest at the foot of the bed. It was the living space of a man who possessed things for their utility and nothing more. He closed the door behind her and slid a heavy wooden beam into place, the sound echoing with a grim finality. Trapped. The thought screamed through her mind, but it was quickly replaced by an overwhelming wave of exhaustion. He gestured with his chin toward the chair nearest the fire. "Sit," he ordered, moving to the stove to pour coffee into a tin mug. He didn't offer her any. The initial interactions were as tense and clipped as his commands. He moved about the small space with an intimidating economy of motion. His powerful, muscular build a constant presence that made the cabin feel even smaller. He was a silent, watchful predator, and she was the strange, wounded creature that had stumbled into his den. She sat stiffly on the edge of the chair, her hands clenched in her lap, a bundle of shaken nerves trying desperately to project a composure she did not feel. She was acutely aware of his eyes on her, a heavy, assessing gaze that seemed to peel back the layers of her being, searching for a weakness or a lie. An undeniable awareness crackled in the suffocating silence, a raw and primal current of energy that flowed between the hardened, solitary man and the terrified, displaced woman. Out here, in the heart of the wilderness with a storm raging outside and a dangerous stranger within, the rules of her old life had ceased to exist. Georgia awoke to a world washed clean, the morning light pouring through the single window with a brilliant, unforgiving clarity. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound silence broken only by the gentle dripping of water from the eaves and the distant, cheerful chirping of birds. For a moment, cocooned in the rough-spun blanket he had wordlessly thrown over her chair before retiring to his own bed, the terror of the previous night felt like a fever dream. But the sight of the heavy beam still barring the door and the imposing figure of Elijah moving with silent purpose by the stove was an immediate, stark reminder of her precarious reality. He had already been awake for hours, she suspected, his dusty blonde hair damp as if he'd just come from washing in a creek, and a fresh pot of coffee was already perfuming the air with its rich, earthy aroma. He hadn't acknowledged her waking, his focus entirely on the slab of bacon sizzling in a cast-iron skillet, his broad, muscular back a formidable wall between them. The sheer physicality of him was overwhelming in the small cabin. Every movement was efficient and powerful, the result of a life lived in constant dialogue with the demanding land. He was a man who seemed to have no need for wasted words or gestures, his actions speaking with a definitive and unassailable authority. After a silent meal of bacon and hard biscuits, which he placed before her without ceremony, Elijah pulled on a worn sheepskin vest, grabbed his hat, and headed for the door. He paused with his hand on the beam, his stormy gray eyes finding hers for the first time that morning. "I'm going to find your stagecoach," he stated, the words not an offer for discussion but a declaration of fact. "Might be something left to salvage." Before she could formulate a response, to thank him or to protest, he was gone, lifting the heavy beam with an ease that made her feel impossibly fragile and leaving the door pointedly ajar. The sudden flood of bright sunlight and open space was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. She was free to leave, to walk out into the wilderness that had so terrified her, but the thought was paralyzing. Where would she go? Which direction would lead to civilization and not deeper into this vast, untamed territory? She was his prisoner, not by lock and key, but by circumstance and her own profound incompetence in this world he so effortlessly commanded. She spent the next hour packing the small cabin, her unease a living thing coiling in her stomach, until the sight of him returning, leading his sturdy horse which now carried her battered trunk, sent a wave of complicated relief through her. He dropped the trunk onto the porch with a heavy thud, the sound a mournful finality. One of the leather straps had been cut clean through, and the lid was splintered, a deep gouge marring its surface. It was a physical manifestation of her derailed life, a journey violently interrupted. Elijah ran a calloused hand over the damaged wood, his expression grim. "The bandits weren't gentle," he observed, his voice a low rumble. "And the harness on your coach is cut to pieces. Axle is broken too. You're not going anywhere on it." He straightened up, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her torn dress and worn-out shoes. "It will take me a day, maybe two, to rig a harness for my spare horse and get you ready to travel. I can take you as far as Redemption. There's a weekly coach from there." The pronouncement hung in the air, a sentence of 2 more days in this strange, tense limbo, 2 more days under the watchful eye of this silent, guarded man. The thought should have terrified her, but woven into the fear was a thread of something else, a reluctant security she hadn't felt since the rifle shot had shattered her world. Here, within the small circle of his fortress, the wolves of the wilderness were kept at bay. Determined not to be a useless burden, a delicate doll waiting to be tended to, Georgia squared her shoulders. "I can't just sit here while you work," she announced, her voice firmer than she felt. "I want to help. There must be something I can do, chores, anything." Elijah looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. It might have been amusement or perhaps pity for her naivete. He considered her for a long moment, his gaze lingering on her soft, uncalloused hands. "There's always work," he finally conceded, a slight shrug of his massive shoulders. His first assignment for her was the milk cow, a placid beast with soulful brown eyes. It seemed simple enough. She had seen illustrations in books. But the reality was a humiliating struggle. The cow flicked its tail impatiently into her face, the 3-legged stool felt impossibly wobbly, and her attempts to coax milk from the udder resulted in a pathetic trickle that mostly missed the pail. Elijah watched from the fence, arms crossed over his powerful chest, an unnerving stillness about him. Just as she was about to give up in frustration, a sound escaped him. It was a low, rough chuckle, quickly suppressed, but she saw it. A brief, startling flash of white teeth against his scruffy beard and a crinkling at the corners of his stormy eyes. The reluctant smirk was a small crack in his granite facade, a moment of shared levity that was so unexpected it startled her more than his perpetual scowl. It humanized him, chipping away at the intimidating wall of silence and revealing, for a fleeting second, the man hiding behind it. Despite the brief thaw, as the day wore on, Georgia's initial sense of security began to curdle back into a pervasive unease. She started to notice things, small details that painted a more sinister picture of her host. It was in the way he never truly turned his back on the open land, how even when he was mending a fence or splitting firewood, his head would lift at the slightest sound, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, searching, always searching. The cabin itself, which had first seemed merely practical, now felt like a strategically designed bunker. Each window offered a clear, unobstructed line of sight to the surrounding clearings, with no blind spots. There were no decorative shrubs or trees near the house that could provide cover for an approaching enemy. It was a home built not for comfort, but for defense. She watched him check the load in the rifle above the mantelpiece, his movements economical and practiced, the familiarity with which he handled the weapon speaking of more than just hunting for game. He was not just a rancher weathering a lonely existence. He was a sentinel, a man standing a solitary, unending watch. The realization sent a fresh shiver of fear down her spine, a deeper and more intelligent fear than her earlier panic. The bandits on the road were a random, chaotic danger. This felt different. This was a specific, anticipated threat, and she had stumbled right into the heart of his vigil. That evening, as twilight bled across the sky, He closed the cabin door and once again slid the heavy wooden beam into its iron brackets. The solid, definitive sound no longer just meant safety from the outside world. It meant she was locked inside with a man whose secrets were as vast and dangerous as the wilderness itself. The following morning broke with a tense and fragile truce hanging in the air between them, a silent acknowledgement of the shared, fleeting moment of levity from the day before. Elijah's gruff exterior seemed, if not softer, then at least less actively hostile, and Georgia found herself moving with a fraction more ease in the confined space of his world. After their sparse breakfast, as he stood by the open door looking out at the vast expanse of his land, he made an announcement that sent a fresh spike of apprehension through her. "I'm low on salt and flour," he stated, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy mountains as if the words were meant for them and not for her. "I have to ride into Redemption for supplies." The casual statement was underpinned by a current of profound reluctance, a deep-seated unwillingness that she could feel from across the room. She saw the muscles in his jaw tighten, the way his hand instinctively drifted down to rest on the butt of his Colt, a gesture of reassurance against a threat only he could perceive. He was a man chained to this piece of land, a guardian who felt the tearing agony of leaving his post, even for a few hours. He turned then, his stormy gray eyes finally pinning her in place, and the intensity of his stare stole the air from her lungs. The fragile truce of the morning vanished, replaced by the raw, uncut authority she had first encountered. "You will stay inside this cabin," he commanded, his voice a low and dangerous rumble that left no room for argument. He took a step closer, his sheer size seeming to shrink the room around her, his presence a physical weight. "You don't wander off. You don't go exploring. You keep this door barred until you hear my signal, 3 sharp knocks, a pause, then 2 more. If anyone else comes to this door, you don't answer it. I don't care if it's God himself with a host of angels, you stay silent and you don't open this door." He held her gaze for a long moment, ensuring his words had sunk deep into her bones, impressing upon her that this was not a suggestion, but a law upon which her survival depended. With a final, sharp nod, he turned and was gone, leaving her with the echo of his warning and the sudden, suffocating silence of the empty cabin. His absence was a palpable void, a hollow space where his intimidating energy had been, and the quiet it left behind was somehow more terrifying than his presence. The hours stretched into an eternity, each tick of the small mantel clock a hammer blow against her fraying nerves. The cabin, which had been her refuge, now felt like a prison, its log walls closing in, its very silence pregnant with the secrets he kept. She tried to busy herself, tidying the already immaculate space, rereading the labels on his tins of food, anything to distract from the oppressive quiet and the chilling finality of his warning. But her eyes kept being drawn to the foot of his neatly made bed, to the small, dark, locked chest that sat there like a silent accusation. It was the one object in the entire cabin that seemed personal, the only thing that didn't serve a purely functional purpose. It was a container of mysteries in a house owned by a man who was himself an enigma. Her curiosity, a trait she had always possessed in abundance, warred with the primal fear his command had instilled in her. He had forbidden her from opening the door, but he had said nothing about the chest. The rationalization was flimsy, she knew, a weak excuse born of a desperate need to understand the man who held her life in his hands, yet it was enough. With trembling fingers, she knelt before the chest. The lock was simple, old iron, and a hairpin pulled from her now unruly golden curls proved to be a surprisingly effective tool. After a few tense moments of fumbling, she felt the mechanism give way with a quiet, satisfying click. She hesitated, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a sense of violation and dread washing over her. This was the private heart of a private man. But the need to know, to arm herself with some sliver of truth, was a more powerful force than guilt. She lifted the heavy lid. The chest did not hold gold or weapons as she might have half expected. Instead, the contents sent a wave of confusion and sorrow through her. On top lay a faded daguerreotype in a simple silver frame, a portrait of a smiling woman with kind eyes and dark hair, her arm wrapped around a small girl of no more than 5 or 6, the child's face alight with a gap-toothed grin. Beneath the photograph was a small, hand-carved wooden horse, its surface worn smooth by the touch of small hands. These were relics of a life, a family, a past filled with a love and tenderness that seemed utterly alien to the hardened man she knew. Her image of him as a born loner, a man simply made of rock and suspicion, began to crumble. He had loved. He had been a husband, a father. Beneath these heartbreaking mementos lay a stack of papers that made her blood run cold. They were wanted posters, crisp and official, offering rewards for the capture, dead or alive, of the members of the notorious Black Creek Gang. She read the names and the crimes, robbery, murder, arson, her horror growing with each one. At the very bottom was the poster for the gang's leader, a man named Kane, his face a cruel sneer under a dark hat. Unlike the others, this poster was worn and creased, the paper softened and frayed at the edges as if it had been folded and unfolded, stared at and handled 1,000 times over. It was the face of a ghost, a specter that haunted this cabin. What did it mean? Was Elijah a former member, hiding from his past? Was he a bounty hunter? Or was he somehow entangled with these monsters? Before she could process the torrent of terrifying possibilities, a sharp, sudden knock echoed from the front door. It was not Elijah's signal. It was a single, confident rap. Her heart leaped into her throat, and she slammed the chest shut, shoving it back against the bed just as the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Hello in there," a cheerful voice called out. "Just your neighbor, Pete. Saw the smoke from your chimney and figured I'd see if Elijah needed a hand with anything." Georgia froze, her body rigid with terror, Elijah's warning screaming in her mind. "You don't answer it." She held her breath, praying the man would assume no one was home and leave, but he was persistent. "Come on now, Elijah, no need to be unfriendly, I know you're in there." The man sounded pleasant, his tone light and affable, but the very act of ignoring Elijah's explicit instructions made him a threat. She remained silent, pressed against the wall, her eyes wide. She heard him sigh theatrically. "All right, have it your way. Just leaving a bit of jerky on the porch for you then." She heard the soft thud of something being placed on the wooden planks, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating. Relief, pure and overwhelming, washed over her. But then the footsteps stopped. She heard a soft chuckle from just outside the window. "You know," the voice of Pete continued, conversational and deceptively casual, "a man as coiled as Elijah, he's got to have his reasons. Folks in Redemption, they give him a wide berth. Say a man doesn't seek out this kind of loneliness unless he's got a dark past he's trying to outrun. You be careful in there, little lady. Not all storms come from the sky." The footsteps finally faded away, leaving Georgia alone once more, her heart hammering not with fear of a stranger, but with a brand new, terrifying doubt about her protector. Elijah returned as the sky began to bruise with the colors of evening, the air thick and heavy with an unshed violence. A great, dark-bellied storm had been gathering on the horizon all afternoon, and it now rolled toward the small cabin with the slow, inexorable menace of an invading army. He rode into the yard not with the weary relief of a traveler reaching home, but with the grim urgency of a soldier returning to his post just before a battle. He didn't speak as he unbarred the door, his stormy eyes immediately sweeping the cabin, checking for any sign of disturbance before landing on her. Georgia stood frozen by the hearth, the artifacts of his hidden life feeling as if they were burning a hole through the wood of the chest. The charged silence between them was suffocating, a taut wire stretched to its breaking point, vibrating with her terror and his coiled tension. As he slid the heavy beam back into place, the first clap of thunder rattled the very foundations of the house, a percussive announcement that there would be no escape, not from the storm outside, nor from the one about to break within. The heavens opened then, unleashing a torrent of rain that hammered against the roof and blurred the windows, effectively sealing them in a world composed only of flickering firelight and the roiling tempest of their shared secrets. The fury of the storm seemed to give Georgia a strange, reckless courage, a sense that the world was already ending, so what was one more cataclysm? She could no longer bear the weight of the unknown, of the terrifying puzzle she had stumbled into. With a defiant cry that was half scream, half sob, she wrenched open the lid of the chest and pulled out the contents, her hands shaking so violently she almost dropped them. She slammed the faded photograph and the stack of wanted posters onto the small table between them, the worn face of Kane staring up like a malevolent specter in the dim light. "Who are they?" she demanded, her voice raw with accusation and fear, pointing a trembling finger at the image of the smiling woman and child. "And who are you? Are you one of them? Are you hiding from the law, is that it? "That man, Pete, he said you had a dark past. He warned me about you." Every question was a stone she hurled at the wall of his silence, every word fueled by the chilling memory of the neighbor's casual menace and the heartbreaking softness of the carved wooden horse she'd held in her hand. She needed the truth, no matter how monstrous it might be, because the uncertainty was a poison that was driving her mad. For a long moment, Elijah just stared at the items on the table, his face a mask of stone, but Georgia saw the flicker of unbearable pain in his eyes, a deep, primal agony that he had kept locked away far more securely than any simple chest. The accusations, the sight of his past laid bare by this stranger he had reluctantly sheltered, seemed to push him over an edge he had been clinging to for years. When he finally looked at her, his carefully constructed walls of stoicism and suspicion didn't just crack. They shattered into a million pieces, revealing the raw, bleeding wound he had been hiding underneath. "They were mine," he rasped, his voice breaking with a grief so profound it was a physical blow. "That was my wife, Sarah, and my little girl, Lily." He picked up the photograph, his calloused thumb tracing the outline of his daughter's face with a desperate, heartbreaking tenderness. "And Kane," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl as he tapped the wanted poster. "He was my friend, my best friend. He was my ranch hand, ate at my table, taught my little girl how to braid a horse's mane. And then he brought his new friends, the Black Creek Gang, to my home. He brought them there to rob me." His gaze lifted from the photo, and in his eyes, Georgia saw a vision of hell. "They didn't just rob me, they took everything." The confession poured out of him then, a torrent of pain and rage held back for 5 long years. He told her of the raid, of the fire, of the sounds he would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. He told her how and his men had murdered Sarah and Lily before his very eyes while he lay bleeding on the floor of his own home. They had left him for dead, but he had survived, fueled by a single, all-consuming purpose: vengeance. This ranch, this fortress of solitude, it wasn't a hideout, it was a trap. For 5 years he had been methodically hunting down every man who had been there that day, his life boiled down to a grim ledger of names to be crossed off. And now only 2 remained. "Kane and Pete," he finished, the name of the friendly neighbor falling from his lips like a curse. "I knew they'd come for me eventually. I've been waiting for them." "And you," he looked at her, his eyes filled with a new, complicated emotion. "You've stumbled right into the end of it." The truth, in its devastating simplicity, was more terrible and more noble than anything she could have imagined. Her fear did not just melt. It transmuted into a wave of profound, aching empathy that washed over her, cleansing her of suspicion. In the heart of the raging storm, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, this broken, dangerous man had bared his very soul to her. The emotional torrent finally broke, and without thought, she moved toward him, her hands coming up to cup his bearded face, her touch a silent offering of comfort. He flinched, as if unaccustomed to gentleness, before leaning into her hand, his own calloused fingers finding hers. The space between them collapsed, and in a moment of shared, raw vulnerability, their mouths met in a kiss that was not gentle or tender, but a fierce, desperate collision of 2 damaged souls finding an anchor in a world that had tried to drown them. It was a kiss of grief and rage, of comfort and a wild, defiant spark of hope, a promise made in the eye of the storm. The morning after was still and quiet, the world washed clean and new. The passion of the night had forged a new reality between them, an unbreakable, unspoken alliance. He was no longer just her grim protector, and she was no longer his terrified ward. They were partners, bound by his tragic secret and her unwavering choice to stand by him. With a grim and resolute purpose, he spent the day not preparing her for a journey away from him, but for the battle that was to come. He took the rifle from above the mantelpiece and patiently, with a steady hand, taught her how to load it, how to aim, how to brace for the kickback, his large frame a solid, reassuring presence behind hers. He was not making her a warrior, but giving her the means to survive. They worked in tandem, moving with an unspoken understanding, boarding the lower half of the windows, checking his supply of ammunition, and planning their defense. His strategic, calculating mind combined with her quick, practical thinking, turning the small cabin into a formidable redoubt. As dusk began to settle, casting long, bloody fingers of light across the land, they arrived. 2 riders emerging from the tree line, their forms silhouetted against the dying sun, the affable Pete and the sneering specter from the poster, Cain. The siege was brutal and swift, a storm of lead and splintering wood. Elijah moved with the deadly grace of a panther, using his intimate knowledge of every angle and shadow, his colt barking with righteous fury. He was not a brawler. He was a wraith, a calculating instrument of vengeance. Georgia, her heart hammering against her ribs, became his second, her fear burned away by a cold, clear purpose. She loaded the spare rifles, her hands steady, calling out the enemy's movements from the window he had assigned her. She watched his back, her world narrowing to this single, desperate fight for the future she had only just discovered. At a critical moment, as Elijah was pinned down, Pete managed to get the drop on him, his pistol rising. A scream tore from Georgia's throat, but it was followed by the deafening crack of the rifle in her hands. She saw Pete stagger, clutching a blossoming red stain on his shoulder, his shot going wide. The look of shocked betrayal on the man's face was satisfyingly absolute. The fight culminated in a final, brutal confrontation in the muddy yard, a showdown between two men who had once been brothers. It was not a duel of honor, but a desperate, ugly brawl fueled by years of grief and a lifetime of betrayal. But Elijah was no longer fighting just for the past. He was fighting for the woman watching from the cabin door, a fierce, golden-haired Valkyrie who had given him a reason to live beyond vengeance. He was victorious. In the profound quiet of the aftermath, with the threat vanquished and the ghosts of his past finally laid to rest, the ranch was still. The reason Georgia had been traveling west, the faceless man in Oregon and the arranged marriage, was a phantom from another life, a story that belonged to someone else. The path ahead was no longer the one that had been laid out for her. Elijah stood before her, the grime of the fight unable to mask the profound change in his eyes. The haunted hardness was gone, replaced by a deep, vulnerable, and overwhelming affection. "This ranch," he said, his voice rough with emotion as he gestured to the land around them. "It's yours, Georgia, if you'll have it." He took her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "And I'm yours, if you'll have me." He offered her not just the safety she had once craved, but a partnership, a life to be built from the ashes. A tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek, but it was a tear of joy. She, who had been running from a life she didn't want, had found a strength in herself she never knew she possessed, and a love she had never dared to dream of. Her wrong turn hadn't led her astray. It had led her home. "Yes," she whispered, the single word holding the weight of her entire future. The story closes with them standing on the porch as the first light of a new day broke over the horizon, their hands clasped together, ready to build their new life.